Hola, les habla René Salgado, presidente de la iniciativa Empresomos Centroamérica. Nos pueden encontrar en empresomos.org. Bienvenidos a este intercambio de ideas sobre ecosistemas emprendedores universitarios que es parte de nuestro programa Empresomos Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica, que estamos implementando en conjunto con CLACS de INCAE y CAMTIC. Los ecosistemas emprendedores universitarios desempeñan un papel importante en el desarrollo emprendedor al conectar la investigación académica con el emprendedurismo y la innovación práctica. Al ser un punto de convergencia entre el conocimiento, el talento y los recursos, las universidades emprendedoras no solo fomentan de manera directa la creación de nuevas empresas y startups, sino que también impulsan el crecimiento económico regional y la generación de empleo. Este entorno promueve la colaboración entre estudiantes, investigadores y el sector privado, creando un círculo virtuoso de transferencia de tecnología, creatividad e impacto social que estimula un desarrollo sostenible y competitivo. Por todas estas razones, el tema reviste particular relevancia para la región centroamericana, tanto para los líderes académicos como para personas y entidades que conforman nuestros ecosistemas emprendedores regionales. En esta entrega, el doctor Daniel Prokop, un experto en el tema de lo que suele denominarse también la Universidad Emprendedora, nos hablará de su libro más reciente bajo el título University Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, Spinouts, Networks and Geography, publicado por Elgar Publishing. El evento empieza con una introducción del autor, seguida de una discusión sobre el tema con la participación de dos prominentes profesionales centroamericanos, el doctor Gustavo Barboza y el doctor Octavio Martinez. Les comparto a continuación un breve resumen del trabajo profesional de cada uno. El doctor Daniel Prokop es profesor titular de Geografía Económica especializado en Desarrollo Económico Regional, Innovación y Redes. Es experto en ecosistemas empresariales, siendo el autor o coautor de más de 12 publicaciones sobre el tema, incluido un reciente libro publicado por Oxford University Press. El trabajo del doctor Prokop ha aparecido en revistas respetadas como International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation o el European Journal of Innovation Management y en el Geoforum. Sus recientes contribuciones a la investigación abarcan una amplia gama de temas, desde la colaboración de las universidades con las pymes hasta la estructura y el impacto de los ecosistemas empresariales, lo que lo convierte en una voz muy respetada en el estudio de los entornos empresariales universitarios y el desarrollo económico regional. El doctor Gustavo Barboza es el titular de la cátedra Jack y Bada Reynolds de Negocios Internacionales de la Universidad Loyola de Nueva Orleans. El doctor Barboza ha publicado numerosos artículos en temas relacionados con desarrollo emprendedor en prestigiosas revistas como el Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research y Social Responsibility Journal. Actualmente es el director del Centro de Negocios Internacionales de la Universidad de Loyola y su investigación se centra en innovación, el desarrollo regional y los negocios internacionales. Él es doctor en Economía Agrícola por la Universidad Estatal de Oklahoma. El doctor Octavio Martínez Argüello enseña estrategia competitiva y corporativa en INCAE Business School de Costa Rica, en Costa Rica, donde anteriormente fue director del Centro Latinoamericano para la Competitividad y el Desarrollo Sostenible de esta misma institución. Las investigaciones del doctor Martínez se centran en estrategias de integración vertical, la localización geográfica de las empresas y la competitividad corporativa. Su trabajo ha recibido el reconocimiento de la Academy of Management y ha sido consultor en formulación de estrategias para diversas industrias en Centroamérica, incluyendo la de los sectores de alimentos y bebidas, el farmacéutico y el energético. Además, es socio de VAC Asociados, una consultora dedicada a la transformación estratégica en América Latina. El doctor Martínez es doctor en estrategia empresarial por la Rodman School of Management de la Universidad de Toronto. Aunque el video de la conversación es en inglés, los subtítulos en YouTube pueden ser configurados para ser leídos en español presionando el botón subtítulos y haciendo la correspondiente selección. Esperamos que este diálogo sea de provecho para toda nuestra audiencia. And Mr. Daniel Prokop has now the floor.
Thank you, René. Thank you for the introduction. So I think first I'll say a few words about the book, and I'll try to be as concise as I can be. before we move on to a bit of a discussion about the book and its meaning, perhaps for Central America context. Can everyone see the screen?
Sure.
Perfect. So this is a book that has been, I think, a lot of years in the making in my head, but finally it sort of came out. And it's about university entrepreneurial ecosystems. It's something I have been working on for quite a while. So I'll say a bit about, a little bit about the origins, where that comes from, and then a little bit about the book. And I'll present the kind of the main argument of the book. Why actually ecosystems? Why should we be looking at university entrepreneurial ecosystems? And perhaps, for Central American context, they may be a bit more interesting than the general or generic entrepreneurial ecosystems because they're quite special. So having studied academic spinouts for quite a while, my whole PhD was devoted to academic spinouts. Even before doing my PhD, I was a researcher and I was working on innovation originating from universities where I was looking at academic spinouts as well. And that kind of sparked my interest because they are very unique companies. They originate from a very non-commercial background. They're companies that try to translate the latest academic knowledge produced at universities and create a company from that in order to deliver that piece of knowledge into solutions for everyday lives that we lead. This is quite an original way of doing things, although this has been happening for quite a long time historically at universities. This is not something new. Now, what's interesting about the university entrepreneurial ecosystems, and this is something that came out from my PhD, where I sort of observed that, okay, we have all these academic spinouts being created at universities, but universities play a very orchestrating role around how, when, and how many university spinouts to create. They actually control the system. They build their own system. They control it. So it's at first, I didn't, the literature about entrepreneurial ecosystems didn't really develop when I was starting my PhD. So I thought it was something to do with networks. And the networks led me to believe that there's some kind of an organization of elements that work together cohesively. And then it came to me, well, there are ecosystems, but these ones are not just generic entrepreneurial ecosystems. These are very concentrated university entrepreneurial ecosystems that are devoted to a very specific type of activity, which is creating academic spin-out companies based on university-generated knowledge. So university is the key player. And that's the important distinction. There is a key player in university entrepreneurial ecosystems. And that actor has a lot of agency in shaping up the university entrepreneurial ecosystem and its outcomes. There is an emerging interest in university entrepreneurial ecosystems, although at this stage I would be saying that it's a growing interest. A couple of years ago when I was starting the book, I think the interest was emerging, but now it seems to be growing. There are conferences devoted to the topic more. We're going to talk during another Empresomos video recording about a special issue together with colleagues Fumi Kitagawa, Shiri Bresnitz, Chiara Marzocchi, and James Cunningham, where we will be proposing a special issue in Journal of Technology Transfer on university entrepreneurial ecosystems to explore the topic even further. Which is very good because that interest is building into something concrete. There's definitely something unique about university entrepreneurial ecosystems. So hopefully, for those who read the book, that uniqueness will be quite clear. So the book, the key message, the key question that I try to answer in the book is, what are the university entrepreneurial ecosystems? What are they all about? And hopefully, for those who read the book, it will emerge as clear that these are very unique concepts. This is a unique structure that in the book I explained that this is a sub ecosystem. We have ecosystems, for example, that govern the whole city, but there are also sub ecosystems that exist within a larger structure of an ecosystem that are very concentrated and devoted to a specific activity, and all the links, actors, and so on are devoted to this activity. And this is what makes university entrepreneurial ecosystems unique. They're focused on specific high technology type companies that are highly innovative firms. So they generate those kind of outputs that the original conceptions on entrepreneurial ecosystems theorize that, well, ecosystems should generate these productive, ideally high technology companies, because innovation is a very important component of economic growth. So if we generate companies that generate more innovation, we should have better economic development outcomes. But the problem is, how do we actually focus on generating these innovative companies? Because the general entrepreneurial ecosystem doesn't really have a structure to generate those innovative companies. But the universities do, because universities are the ones that create the knowledge and they transfer that knowledge into companies. They create companies that are innovation driven. So if we focus a bit more on university entrepreneurial ecosystems and nurturing them, we can actually achieve some of that kind of thinking behind, generating more innovation activity within economies. Because this is the origins, and this is the sort of perfect translation of knowledge, perfect generation of innovation that comes directly from the source, directly from the university, which is the source of knowledge. I find that quite interesting. I find that quite unique because in the general entrepreneurial ecosystem literature, knowledge comes from somewhere. Some entrepreneurs identify an idea somewhere, but it isn't quite specified where that knowledge comes from local university, from the experience over the years. It comes from somewhere, it emerges. But in university entrepreneurial ecosystems, it's very clear. There's a source of that knowledge, and that knowledge has a very clear pathway. I think that the book, this is the contents of the book, through a number of chapters, I think I showed that not only we can understand the university entrepreneurial ecosystems a bit better, thanks to the book, but the side effect of that is that we can understand the general entrepreneurial ecosystems better as well. Because there's a lot of under-theorization of entrepreneurial ecosystems. There's a lot of critique of them, that there's not enough understanding, for example, about boundaries, what actors do in them, what are the links that are external to the ecosystems doing. But when we talk external links, then we should be talking about boundaries, but there are no studies talking about boundaries. So I've seen that recently, I think in the past couple of weeks, that there was one study coming up. But I have done the job in the book as well, which hopefully clarifies those things. I think focusing on the university entrepreneurial ecosystem allowed me to understand the challenges of the broader literature around entrepreneurial ecosystems and where those theoretical gaps needed filling. I had to fill them myself since I noticed them, because without filling them, it was basically difficult to understand how the university entrepreneurial ecosystems fit into the whole picture. But they do, and they do very clearly. So who is the book aimed at? At first I thought that it was mostly aimed at universities and technology transfer office individuals and professionals within the universities that deal with translation of knowledge generated at universities. But actually, and obviously scholars like me and Octavio and Gustavo are interested in entrepreneurship. But I think that there's a wider appeal, and that includes policymakers interested in the knowledge commercialization coming out of universities, but also policymakers interested in economic growth or economic development of countries or regions. University related policymakers as well, in terms of, well, how should we shape up the policies around the universities, the policies around higher education in countries, in regions, in states. And one thing I found out, because I'm trying to set up my own spin-out company now, that venture capitalists are very interested in the topic as well. So they do invest in academic spin-out companies, and they want to understand as well how these things function and how companies become more successful and how certain universities are more successful than others. What makes them more successful? What explains these things? But I think that the book is also aimed at the spin-out founders to understand where they fit in. You know, what's their role in the whole ecosystem? How can they understand their journey from a different angle? And also to all the sort of accelerator and incubator initiatives aimed at technology startups. But as I said, you know, this is about university entrepreneurial ecosystems, but the side effect of the book is that it kind of has a wider appeal around all entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I thought, because and Presomos has more of a Central American focus, then I'll say a few words perhaps about how I can see this book being relevant to Central America context from my limited knowledge about Central America, perhaps. So correct me around everything, Renee, but I know that in Central America, the universities, they do generate research. But I've read a couple of articles where it was said that there is not enough of research compared to nations like the US or European nations. There's not enough being invested in generating research. It may be not appreciated by policymakers and so on. There's institutional or cultural issues around generating more research and actually stimulating that activity. But the most important thing is that there is research going on, and that's the important thing, that there is new knowledge being produced. To me, all universities can develop university entrepreneurial ecosystems, because I've seen, you know, my main kind of case study is the United Kingdom, and there are a wealth of different universities that are teaching-oriented universities. They still do some research, and there are typical research-oriented universities like my own, Cardiff University, that produce a larger chunk of research. All of these universities, they develop university entrepreneurial ecosystems to some extent or another. They differ a lot on how they develop them in terms of composition, how many and what type of actors they connect with in order to develop that ecosystem, and how they actually configure these actors to function, you know, how these actors actually generate the outputs from this ecosystem. So the one thing that comes from my work and partly is related to my own research interest is that networks matter a lot, okay? Because in a resource-constrained environment, and certain universities may lack resources because universities may not want to devote enough resources to that type of activity, and there may be a policy issue, you know, at a national level where policymakers may not want to devote attention to commercialization activity. Networks can overcome these problems. Networks can overcome institutional voids. Networks can overcome lack of resources, because sometimes connecting to another actor may actually introduce new resources into our own network. For example, And in the UK, just recently, there have been announced some initial partnerships between universities to try to sort of centralize activity around technology transfer offices. So around having a university entrepreneurial ecosystem, but instead of just one university, as it used to be, that all universities performed a very isolationist kind of policy as university entrepreneurial ecosystems. Now they start collaborating. And it's a bit of a trial. We'll see how it works out. But it's a really good kind of message that yes, universities can collaborate. They don't need to compete with each other because they obviously compete for students. They compete in the same market for students, and they compete in the same market for research grants. But why should they compete if collaboration can often generate better outcomes? So there is that, and this networks or links, they really need to be stressed. The developing links is with different actors is an important tool to offset inadequate resources that a university entrepreneurial ecosystem may have. Now, there's also, an importance of policies. So the institutional context within the university, whether there's enough support for this activity, and the support may be changing over time. It may be more positive, more negative at some point, and then positive again. I've seen it across some UK universities where the support from generating, having a university entrepreneurial ecosystem devoted to academic spin-out companies was, for example, sort of switched off because the university didn't see it strategically as important. They wanted to focus more on students. And then this was years later switched back on. So there are these behaviors where perhaps it's related to the leadership team of the university, and that changes the way they think about what the universities should be doing. But it shows the role of the university as this orchestrator of the ecosystem, that the university decides what to do and which way to forge into the future with the ecosystem, and what kind of outputs or outcomes to create out of it. And I think the last message, I think, out of the book that I think I would like everyone to remember, and I think is very relevant to Central American context, is that the funny thing is that university entrepreneurial ecosystems that I've observed in the UK, there are huge inequalities between them, and this comes partly out of spatial inequalities. As an economic geographer, I'm interested in all the geographical inconsistencies or inequalities between places and actors that are based in different places, and why their outcomes are different because they're, for example, in London compared to Sheffield or compared to Manchester or Glasgow. Now, what I notice is that yes, we have those really well-resourced and endowed contexts like London, for example, where we have an amazing presence of venture capital investors and loads of accelerators, incubators, and those very experienced entrepreneurs in high technology and so on, businesses. But sometimes the resources devoted and spent on the university entrepreneurial ecosystems in London do not generate the same outcomes per resource as the ones that are in more peripheral places, in the university entrepreneurial ecosystems in peripheral places, which have, a disadvantage by just the pure location where they are, disadvantaged by the resources available to them, but the way they allocate these resources to their activity actually generates greater outcomes per resource spent than places that are actually swimming in advantages. Okay, and that's a very interesting finding to observe, because this actually shows that, hey, if you are a university entrepreneurial ecosystem in a place that doesn't necessarily have loads of support for you, it doesn't mean that you have to perform very badly. That doesn't preclude your performance. It's what you're going to do with that. Okay, you can actually calibrate your university entrepreneurial ecosystem to generate great outputs and great outcomes for the local economy. Okay, I will conclude on that, and I think we can start a bit of a discussion. Thank you, and I hope it wasn't too long.
Thank you very much, David. And let's open, the questions and comments. I just have one, if you allow me to make an initial comment. Maybe I misunderstood, Daniel, but you somehow stressed the fact that university ecosystems in Great Britain focus more on the technology enterprise scale. In Central America, we have two types of universities, the public and the private ones. When you have a public university, the government will say to you, well, these are the sectors that you are supposed to, to foster or to support or whatever. You see, that's what happens with the Universidad de Costa Rica, okay, which is, has a more pluralistic approach to support, different sectors. But if you have a private university, you can say, we're going to focus on technology or high technology or medium technology or whatever. And so, I just wanted to mention that in passing, okay, that, and probably you didn't mean that it should be restricted to technology, right? And it might
No,
be,
no, no.
okay.
I don't mean that it needs to come out from STEM subjects, from science, from
Okay.
engineering school, from maths and physics schools. I don't mean it at all because in the UK, for example, there's been this recognition of the so-called shape fields. So from social sciences, humanities, arts, and so on. Were there actually academic spin-outs created from those fields? And some of my research that I've published already has looked at the bias, towards this traditional technical, fields, and whether this actually affects the creation of numbers and of spin-out companies and the survival. But it doesn't. There is no bias. So actually, what we observe is that all these companies are created from different departments of the universities. They don't need to be from just the physics department and that's it. And the physics department gets all the resources because that's the only department everyone wants to promote. No, actually, it's everything that the university does can be commercialized, which is a good message because knowledge is there everywhere in the arts, art schools, it's in the social sciences, and it is in the engineering schools as well. I think that's a positive thing, and I actually have met quite a few people who are starting up companies from these departments, from social sciences, from history schools, from archaeology schools, and so on. It actually works, and there doesn't need to be this kind of prescription. I may talk about technology companies because the standard language in this related to academic spin-out companies was focusing on technology transfer. But that technology is actually knowledge transfer. So it's more knowledge transfer rather than technology.
Thank you. Okay. Who wants us to go first? Gustavo or okay, go ahead,
Yes,
Gustavo.
I would like to, first and foremost, thank you, Rene, for organizing this very interesting, thought-provoking, and very timely, conversation that we hope we can add a few ideas to the excellent work that Daniel just presented to us on a plethora of fields coming together in a very well-written, very engaging, in a way, very easy to read book based on, the complexity of what you're presenting, because it's nothing short of a very set of complex, elements. And you mentioned it very, very nicely somewhere in the first part that there's a lot has happened, but there is somewhat disorganization on how this is coming together. And I think when you bring together a number of concepts and you try to hone in within the reality of emerging markets, some more, some less emerging, some more or less emerged, what we realize is that there is a history that somehow we carry, and that history specifically, and I'm going to try to stay within the universities as much as I can, but being part of an ecosystem is complicated to only hone it into one. But many of these universities, were state-funded in most Latin America, and they were created sometime, some as early as 1800s, but many of those in the 1900s, second, half, end of first half, second half, with a specific mandate. And the mandate of those universities, and Octavio, you might remember, you might be too young, but Rene, you probably do remember, when we were in the university, I was in Costa Rica, I'm a grad from the University of Costa Rica, my alma mater. Even though I was in the economics and business program, I was being trained to be a bureaucrat. And my goal was to get a job with the government and hopefully make it through the government and then become a government employee doing what governments do, right? And that was there. The idea of, and I'm going to take you up on the offer of the special issue on the Journal of Technology Transfer. Let me know when that's open. I have a couple of ideas there. The idea of commercialization, and that's one paper that I'm writing, the one-word title paper, commercialize. The idea of commercializing that knowledge wasn't really thought to be an outcome that you should get out of universities. You were supposed to get educated, you were supposed to give back to society by becoming a bureaucrat. But all that came to hard stop with the crisis of the 1980s, predominantly 1980s, and the collapse of the external debt, and then the lost decade that has haunted Latin America for a long time. And here, Octavio, through the class, can talk a little bit more about that, because that's part of the work that INCAE does. And so what we get is now there is a significant shift, right? And this significant shift then questions, what's the role of universities, right? Why do we even have universities? And it comes to mind that there is two primarily goals. One is, of course, to create human capital. And the second one is to provide opportunities to democratize those opportunities and give social mobility to people, right? Primary and secondary education do not seem to be enough for people to move up. But then this creates the next level of questions. Do universities have the incentives to do that? And you mentioned a clear distinction between universities in the developed world and universities in the emerging markets is the importance of academic scholarly output. And that is publications and peer-reviewed journal articles that might or might not make it into a commercialized idea, but as a standard on how to measure productivity coming up from those that are teaching. And so what we encounter is that when those incentives are not provided or requirements, then what we observe, and Octavio, please correct me if I'm mistaken, even though you are in a place that is very different, INCAE is a unique institution within the system, is the time that faculty should be allocated for research and publications very quickly moves into consulting as a way to generate additional income that is very specific to very unique sectors or industries. And that knowledge does not get published because it's proprietary, right? So it cannot be commercialized. It's specific to a firm. And that's where you develop your niche, and then you have, the possibility to become well-known and then have, that potentiality, which leads to the issue of competition, right? If I'm have a consulting business, I might not share with you because I'm competing with you. Whereas when we look at the alternative, when you are publishing in universities in the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, then what you get is the knowledge is available, your reward comes, as number of citations, and then from there you go, right? So this creates an issue of what I entitled in a paper that I recently published in the Small Business Economics Journal, the presence of missing links that are created because of lack of interconnectivity of human capital within ecosystems. And that is, you get places that generate a tremendous amount of human capital that do not capture that knowledge. Those places become net exporters of knowledge. You have college towns in the US, you have, cities in Central America that produce, I'll just give you the numbers. UCR has right now in the borderline of 60,000 students, give or take. My question is how many of those actually go back into business development, provided that an entrepreneurship program doesn't exist to begin with. You have classes on business, but not classes on entrepreneurship. So that's already a void. Not to mention then, are those students that are coming out fully bilingual, ready to engage in absorption, which is another big concept, right, by Cohen and Leventhal, absorption of that knowledge that is gravitating, uncommercialized, following the work of David Aldrich on the knowledge spillover theory of entrepreneurship, right? Who is commercializing that? So the presence of those missing links and the lack of absorbability within the system and the lack of the incentives for people to understand that you could become your own boss, right? You don't have to be a wage worker. You could become your own boss and generate your own company. Is still missing there, right? It is not present in the way that it should be. So an alternative that we've been working on, and it is a process that takes a long time, is, well, what happens with the diaspora? What happens with the people that have left the country and wants to reinsert itself, within the economic system? What are some mechanisms to regain part of that knowledge that is being created abroad? And so I have been working very closely with the president and director of the University of Costa Rica in establishing a diaspora where we developing countries could create what is known as a figure known as research affiliates. And that is people that will publish, that will get the recognition of having the name of the local university without having to invest any money because the money is coming from the developed world. And once you have those, then you start reinserting the interest of producing knowledge that is unique to each one of the markets, and then start building on this concept of how can we forward that commercialization of ideas generated within the university or outside the university via this creation of links, right? It's not an easy process. There's a lot of resistance because the diaspora is perceived as competition, and in some ways unfair competition, because the people come with longer CVs on publications and what have you. And it just goes that way. But that's how the cookie crumbles in many Latin American markets, and some more in some less, right? Now, I can go on for hours, but I'm going to stop here. I'm going to give the floor to Octavio so we continue engaging in this really, really interesting and timely conversation. Oh, I'll finish with one thing before I forget. The dialogue in emerging markets all the way up to the early 2000s plus has been always macroeconomic stability, fiscal deficit, balance of payments, monetary policy from the top down. And there has been very little conversation from the bottom up. Creation of ideas, entrepreneurship development, creation of ecosystem, not just clusters, ecosystems, and then moving the generation of economic growth from a different perspective, not top down, but bottom up. That conversation is just starting, and I really believe that there should be a significant shift from policy making from the bottom up, not so much from the top down. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gustavo. Okay, Octavio has the floor.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I'd like to join Gustavo as well, thanking Rene and Empresomos for organizing this important event. Thank you, Daniel, as well, for this important contribution. And I think that this audience feels a special connection with the topic, because somehow we've been involved with different academic institutions in some capacity in our life, right? So for us, it's very stimulating to hear that universities may play a role and have a broader impact on society than just creating knowledge, training people, and we can contribute indeed directly to boost entrepreneurship, innovation, transfer of technology, and all that, right? But as you mentioned as well, this is kind of an emerging topic, right? It's not in the mainstream of the literature. It's not very common to be joined with different academics that are paying a lot of attention and doing very interesting analysis as you're doing on the topic. So I'd like to go in a different direction and ask you, Daniel, if you can tell us a little bit about your life and professional journey that has led you to research academic spinouts and university entrepreneurial ecosystem. Why this topic? And what has been the motivation behind it?
Thank you, Octavio. I think it's a very complex story because it sort of begins with my high school and the options I had to go to choose what I wanted to study. I always wanted to study nuclear physics, but I ended up studying business management, right? I ended up going to a business school. And the whole problem was about the perception of universities by parents. You know, my parents were saying, well, if you're going to go to study physics, we're not going to support you. Because it was considered that physics is not appealing. You know, it's just science. Traditional science is not appealing. Being at the university is not appealing as a career because you're just going to sit there, teach there a couple of hours, and then you do nothing. You know, that's the general perception outside of the academia, right? I always found it very troubling because you know, when you're the kind of nerdy, geeky student that always achieves top marks, you know, you always think very differently about knowledge, and universities are perceived more positively by such individuals. So I always thought that there was more to universities. And when I finished my undergrad studies, I started working as a researcher on a project related to university industry knowledge transfers or interactions. And that's where I met with academic spinouts. You know, I came across academic spinouts and I started thinking, well, so the universities actually do far more than everyone thinks they do. They do some stuff that no one actually would relate to universities, which is they are creating companies. They are creating not just any companies, they're creating innovative, high-tech companies that bring in some cancer treatments, they bring in some new materials, they bring some totally new engineering solutions to the market. They bring in, you know, hip replacements, you know, made from a different material that is better absorbed by the body. You know, the stuff going on that they is so radical, you know, at universities. I devoted a whole PhD to that, you know, because I thought, well, I want that perception that is hidden to be a bit more out there, you know, to change the way people think about universities. And partly this book, I hope, you know, if some lay people will actually buy it and read it, which I hope some will do, I think they will appreciate that universities do far more and do some fancy, trendy things like entrepreneurship, right? That they were not prescribed to do. I mean, the literature about academic spinouts, you know, it has been in the background, you know, for a few decades. You know, it was about, you know, universities do create companies. But it was never about that the universities actually have a very key orchestrating role, that they create ecosystems. There was never a linkage between different actors, elements, and that they all come together into the whole big picture. It was never like that. It was always, well, there's a university, there's a spin out, that's it. That's the limit of the linkage and of theoretical thinking about this relationship. So my personal journey is basically from that interest that universities actually are about a lot more than just you know, doing some boring stuff. Universities do some really fancy stuff, some very interesting, exciting work. And it's not just, you know, a career in academia is not just about teaching students or just doing the research and sitting there closed in your office in front of a computer or locked up in a lab for a whole night. It's more than that. You can be an entrepreneur in academia. And I think that's that should be quite an inspiring message to many students who do not want to do a PhD or stay in academia, right? Because they see it as a very an appealing career because, well, they could go to industry and work in these fancy businesses, but they don't think that actually they could create a business when being in academia. I think this changes the way of thinking about you know, what the universities are for. As Gustavo mentioned, you know, these things have been changing and reshaping, and it's important to mention that universities have more missions than just teaching, than just generating human capital. This human capital can be employed later on, but perhaps universities need to create the jobs, through the companies, through commercializing that knowledge, creating those jobs for that human capital that they generate themselves, right? That they have students that are really capable, trained in some of their knowledge, in some of the stuff that they generated at universities in terms of research, but they don't really find easy employment that links to that kind of knowledge that they've been educated in. But perhaps through promotion of that kind of route of creating spin-out companies, there may be jobs actually for those individuals, that perfect fit. I hope this partly answers your question, Octavio.
Definitely.
Do you have
Thank
a
you very much,
follow-up question,
Daniel.
Octavio? Do you have a follow-up question? You had a few.
Yes, indeed. And let me as well take advantage of Daniel's expertise on the topic. And the following questions that I had in mind is that, Daniel, if we want to strengthen our university entrepreneurial ecosystems in the region in Central America, what would be key recommendations and learnings that we should take from your book?
It's a very good question. Very difficult question because I don't know much about Central American universities. There's a bit of context that Gustavo gave me, which is great. I did a bit of reading before this meeting, and from what I can see, I think my book proposes that the successful university entrepreneurial ecosystems typically. The success could be attributed to two major factors. One of them is the composition of the university entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the composition is based on developing the links to all these key actors. So to the investors, to experienced entrepreneurs, because they need to be out there to help understand whether there is actually any opportunity within the knowledge that someone wants to commercialize. We need to have those individuals to talk to them because they know. They understand the market, they understand how to create companies, they've done it before. So having those links, these connections to science parks, for example. Many universities around the world build loads of science parks, right? Some countries build too many science parks, probably. In Brazil, there's a whole bunch of science parks, right? And usually the universities weren't using these science parks very well because they were not really used for university-generated companies. They were just locally based companies and multinational large companies locating themselves on the science parks. So it was quite a weird mix of things. But actually, the science parks, they have that talent of companies. They have bring in those connections, even to multinationals that the universities could use to identify opportunities from their knowledge. Okay, what can we do with that knowledge? Through that science parks and who is on that science park could help us with that. And another thing, apart from that compositional aspect, so developing a network with actors, key actors of the ecosystem, is the filtration mechanism of that university entrepreneurial ecosystems perform. So the ecosystem is basically, in my mind, it's a network of actors. And each of these actors plays a role in trying to understand whether this piece of knowledge should be commercialized. Should we devote any resources and efforts to commercialize this piece of knowledge? And universities should be playing a role in terms of calibrating that filtration mechanism. So some universities produce too many companies out of their knowledge, and many of them are not successful as a result. And largely because there are too many companies produced for the resources available to the university to actually support properly. And there are some universities that don't produce a lot of companies from their knowledge, but they are really well supported and they become very successful then. And these are these different stories that if university calibrates that filtration mechanism, and calibration is through these actors in that network that form the ecosystem itself, they can actually start reallocating resources. Because when we first generate knowledge at universities, we go to a technology transfer officer, right? And we say, well, I think this may be kind of become a company. And they sort of make their first evaluation. And after their evaluation, they will tell you, well, go out there, knock on some doors, and see if it actually makes sense. Okay, so we've got another filtration mechanism built in. You go out there and you actually filter it out with the ecosystem, with the experienced people, potential customers, and so on. And after all that happens, you may go to a venture capitalist to raise your first funding, or to business angels, and they will be assessing you as well. They will be looking, well, should I give the money to this or not? Is this worthy of it? Is this actually going to generate a return? Can it actually become a product within a specific amount of time? And then, is it pragmatic? Is it realistic? They make an assessment. They filter out all these different entrepreneurial ideas that come from universities, and they assess how many of them can actually be supported with the limited amount of money the investors may have to actually distribute. And after that, we have multiple rounds of investment, but we also have customers that they're all doing this kind of filtration mechanism in an ecosystem. They actually look at, okay, are these companies' products any good? Should we actually be buying them? It's a filtration mechanism, right? And then we have investors, another round of funding, right? Raising funding. Should we invest in this company again? Should we invest in these companies? This other venture capitalists invested before, but they still need some funding to develop something. Should we invest in it? So it's all about allocation of resources. I think universities in Central America, they can try and calibrate their way of filtering those opportunities. If there's not that much research going on, they may start small, right? They may start with, let's say, a couple of companies created within a year, but support them well. Support them well so that they are actually, most of them can be successful. If most of them are successful, after a few years, they will come to a recycling point. They will develop talent. They will be hiring the human capital locally. Hopefully locally, they won't relocate somewhere else, right? That will lead to bringing in more investment and resources to the local area. And this will create all these champions and success stories that will motivate other people to actually create new firms. And that then brings in resources also to university. At least in the UK and American context, the universities own intellectual property. They make money on those companies because they own equity in academic spin-out companies. But even if the university were not to make money, just the nature of commercialization activity, that there's going to be a company within the local economy that is generating employment, and that is creating those opportunities and talent, and showing that people can actually do these things, and attracting venture capital kind of interest, right? Because venture capitalists, they observe these things around the universities. I talked to enough of them. They seem to be looking at, okay, is this university any good? They look at what they do, they look at their success rate, and they actually see, well, we may want to work with them in the future because they've been doing quite well. So creating these success stories, I think, is a very important function for any university entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it's having those networks, but also trying to make sure that these networks work and they deliver some outputs. It doesn't need to be a lot of outputs to begin with. Even one successful company can change the shape of the future of a region or of a local area so much that, Facebook, for example, or the whole Silicon Valley, it was created originally from just a handful of companies, right? It wasn't created by hundreds of companies. This then leads to multiple companies in the future. So I think this is perhaps the key message. And maybe the other sideline message that I mentioned before in my last slide is that don't think of yourself, if a university is located in a peripheral region or thinks of itself, well, we're not that good as, for example, a Harvard University or MIT. We're not the same institution. Well, do the best you can with the resources you have. Okay, just do that. That's enough. That's a lot already. And usually what that leads to is that they actually deliver greater outputs than that MIT potentially could deliver with the same amount of resources. Simply because they employ their own efforts, their own initiatives, and their own energies, and they actually do deliver potentially better outcomes. And I think that's a very important message, you know. Resources, yes, it's great to be in a very wealthy region with loads of resources. Sometimes this is not possible, but it's about actually employing what you've got.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. What do you have another question, Gustavo?
I have a follow-up on Octavio's, comment that make me think of something that I think is still part of the institutional working of most state universities or state-funded universities in Latin America. This is the case of Costa Rica, and that is something that is known as the TCU, Trabajo Comunal Universitario. And it is a process that a requirement that students need to complete to graduate, and that is something that typically is done as a service to a government institution. I remember back in my days, I had to do a survey for the Department of Labor, and I had to follow up on companies all over the Central Valley. I don't know, maybe 150 companies collecting data on employment and da-da-da. That went into a hole, never did anything. I did the exercise. But what if, universities in Latin America engage in a practice similar to that in the US, which is the requirement of internships? And this could be paid or non-paid internships where you have on the job, active learning, and individuals can go and be in a company, learn, get some of that spillover just by being there, right? There is these days a significant increase in foreign direct investment that requires large amounts of highly educated, critical thinking capital. So that could be a first take on first spillovers. Let's go and see what I can learn, and perhaps I can work for this company and then learn more, or perhaps I can then come up with an idea. So that's one idea that could work. A second idea is the institutionalization of business proposals as graduating programs instead of the typical thesis that has to be written on a topic for business students. You might want to create, and especially on courses such as strategic management, a business plan for an idea that students might have in or a study of a case that following the Harvard model case that could lead to thinking of what a business would look like. And then start giving this new generation of human capital the thinking of perhaps I work for someone for a couple of years, may not be family, may be family, and then I spin off my own idea, not at the year, T+4, but it could be T+8, T+10 once I have some of that knowledge, right? And then we get into the issues of the institutionalization within the university. Who owns the idea? And is it the faculty or is it the university? And here there is a number of business models that could work. Faculty that creates an idea, that commercializes, may get reduced teaching load to work more on that because it buys out time through this funding, right? So that's another option that could be used for faculty that are much more engaged in the interest of spinning off some of these ideas, right? And then lastly, the active searching of opportunities via cooperations or grants with companies that come with superior technology, typically multinationals, that need certain type of work to be done and actively be done. To this end, I'm going to give you an example. It's not a good example. It's actually a counter example. A large multinational company needed to get some lab work done in Costa Rica, and they reached out to the testing lab at the engineering department of the UCR. And they were very willing to provide some support and see what resources were needed. The counterpart at the university, what they asked from the multinational was, would this company be willing to provide us a little bit funding to provide coffee and cookies for the seminars that we have every week? And you are like, come on, this company is giving you an open letter to engage in active granting to provide resources and use the labs, and you are only asking for coffee and cookies for the breaks? And instead of equipment, and instead of research grants, and instead of job opportunities, which then speaks of the mentality that again has been ingrained for so long in our brains. You are only there to do, what is good for society via, working for the government and or for the government, not the alternative. You're here to do good through the creation of ideas, generation of spillovers, and the commercialization of these ideas that create jobs and then create opportunities for others, right? So again, I go circle back to the top-down view from the bottom-up view, where competition may be a good thing. So my 5 cents on that comment that Octavio made. So right on point. Thank you, Octavio.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think partly what you relate to is that institutional setup within the universities and within countries, that there's a particular perception of how things work, there's a particular setup how things work, and that sort of needs to change as well. There should be some sort of institutional innovation. It needs to be happening in countries. It can't just be the way things were used to be done. Cultures change over time. And cultures within the universities should change as well. So yeah, a very good example.
Okay. Do you have any other question, or should we close for the? Okay. Let me say a few words in Spanish as just closing remarks, and then I would like to take a couple of minutes, when we close the session from you, okay? Thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias a Daniel por compartirnos sobre su interesante investigación acerca de ecosistemas universitarios, y a Gustavo y Octavio por este interesante e inspirador diálogo que es parte de las cuestiones que abordamos en nuestro programa Empresomos Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica. También agradecemos la atención de nuestra audiencia, y si están interesados en estos intercambios de conocimiento, los invitamos a suscribirse al canal de Empresomos en YouTube y visitar el blog de Conectividad Emprendedora en nuestro portal empresomos.org.